Okay, this is a story time of how the Spirit of Jesus Christ came into my home. Okay, so it sounds kind of crazy, but just listen, hear me out. Okay, so this all begins with my daughter because I did not grow up religious. Like, my family did not go to church or anything like that. So I do not really know the story of Jesus. Like, I know who he was. I know like the basics, but the details of like the story of his life I don't really know. So with my daughter, obviously I'm very spiritual. I talk to spirit every day. I'm very connected spiritually, but as far as like Jesus as a person, I don't know that story. So my daughter goes to a private preschool, and in her preschool she's learning about God, Jesus, the Lord. And she's been, she comes home and she sings her little hymns and she talks about the Lord. And you know she's asking me questions, and I'm like, you know what? I don't really know the answer to that. I should probably look up the story of Jesus so that I can answer these questions, because I'm like, well, Jesus was a real person, right? We should look it up. We should find out his story of when he was alive, not just the teachings of like after he's passed. So I went online, started Googling, and the first thing I found was that Jesus, there's no historical evidence because, and it's not because it wasn't real, it's just because that everyone at that time period, if you were to try to find evidence of anyone at the time period, 99% of people, they just weren't preserved. It was just so long ago that they just, it was really hard to preserve things back then. So I'm like, okay, so there's no like actual historical evidence of Jesus, so I can't teach her about that, but there's scripture. So I was like, well, I'm going to just read that and read the story of him. So I start at the beginning. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, wow, this is really interesting because this is so psychic. And I don't know why I never thought about that, but it's just like amazes me how psychic the text is. So it talks about how, Mary and Joseph see the angel. Now, I'm not saying everything that I read, I believe, right? But I'm just saying, I think that the story was probably manipulated a little bit by man throughout the years, but the idea is what matters. And the idea was that they were visited by an angel and said that, this man's going to come to earth and change lives and do a lot of good. And that's the message that I got out of it. So, but as they go on, they talk about how when they saw Jesus, he looked at them and his face looked like the sun. Now, when I read that line, I was like, that's really interesting, because whenever I channel spirit, that's how I see spirit. I see that they're glowing like the sun. Like, they look like, just like you would see me right now, but if your face were alive, like every little, like your hair even, like every little part of your body was like gold and sparkling. That is how I see spirit, especially in a dream. That's how I know it's a visitation, because they don't look like this. They look like the sun. That was like the perfect explanation for it. So whenever I read that, I was like, well, that's actually really interesting, because that's actually how I see spirit also. So now I'm like, oh my gosh, Jesus was so psychic. And so he talks about how he goes off and prays, and he'll come back and he'll teach his disciples, and he teaches the word of God. And I'm like, he's channeling. Like, no, I've never heard anyone put it that way before. Like, I've never heard a church say Jesus was psychic, right? And in fact, I've heard the opposite, where they say that, like, you shouldn't listen to psychics, right? Well, then he talks about in the story of Jesus, he talks about how he teaches people. They're like, other people are teaching your word, and they're not you, and they're pretending to be you. And he's like, you'll know a good tree by the fruit it produces. If it produces good fruit, then it's a good tree. And I'm like, that, okay, because I don't really remember hearing about that in church. I remember hearing like, all these false prophets, and like, you can only praise Jesus only. And I'm like, you know what? This is interesting, because I guess it's all about interpretation, but to me that sounds like I'm just spreading the word, and there'll be many people who spread the word. And he does talk about how there's a huge harvest, but there's not enough people to harvest, right? And to me that sounds like there's a lot of people who want to know about this word, but I can't heal every single person out there, so I'm going to need people to help me. And he even decides to have his disciples go and start healing people too, right? I'm not trying to get too into like the religious side of things. I'm just telling you the story that I read, okay? But I thought this was interesting. I was like, this is so interesting. And it's true, because I listened to a lot of Bashar and a lot of Abraham Hicks. And how do you know they're a good tree? Because the fruit that they produce, the results, whenever I listen to their advice and I follow their advice, which is following your highest passion, doing what, rings true to you, your life gets better. And that is what Jesus was saying. I feel like Jesus was one of the same of who they were. Like, and I feel like there are many other people who are like Jesus who have come since him. I think that he just started like this movement, you know? But it's just interesting because, yeah, anyone that you listen to from here on out, as long as like you're getting good results and you're happy and your life is improving from listening to them, then, you know, you can listen to them. I thought that was interesting too. And so, you know, if you end up getting like a tarot reading, or if you talk to a psychic medium, because I know a lot of you are, some of you are afraid, like there's that stigma. It's like we're talking to the devil, right? But if the information is helping you and your life has improved from the information, then it's a good tree because it produced good fruit. And that's what Jesus himself said, right? So then there gets to this part where, you know, I decide to look up the monuments, or like these cities that he's mentioning. So I look up the Sea of Galilee. When I see the Sea of Galilee, I'm like, I've been there before. I've astral traveled there in a dream before. I didn't know where I was visiting, but now that I'm seeing it, I'm like, that was the Sea of Galilee that I was visiting. I've been there multiple times in a dream. Nothing's ever happened, but I just remember standing there, and there wasn't sand. That's the only difference in the dream. There was no sand. It was just a big rock slab. But my guess is that that was like right when the earth was formed. Perhaps like that sacred land, you know, it takes time for sand to form because the water has to erode the rock away to form sand. So I'm like, I must have been visiting there when it was first formed. That holy land was like first formed, and I got to like, my spirit went there before anything happened, anything existed there. So I thought that was cool. Then I'm looking through more of the pictures and I see this church. And this church, when I saw that, I was kind of blown away because I've been there before also in a meditation. Now, if you look up James Van Praagh guided meditation, you can try that meditation also. But I did this meditation years ago before I even had kids, before I even picked up a deck of tarot cards. And that church is where I saw 3 of my spirit guides. And I just couldn't believe it. Like when I was looking through these like historical landmarks that Jesus was at, I was like, I cannot believe that that was what I saw in my meditation. It was pretty cool. Now I'm sitting there and I'm reading these texts and I'm moved, especially looking at all these landmarks. I'm moved, and I just can feel the energy. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like so interesting to me. And as I'm sitting there, my son's toy turns on all by itself. And it was one where it's like, it's a really big toy, and the spokes were like, zzz, and then it turns off. And then me and him looked at each other. We're like, what was that? And he was like, whoa, what happened, Mommy? And I'm like, I don't know, that was weird. And then I'm reading more of the text, and I get to this quote that I'm like, oh my gosh, that quote was so powerful. Like, this is really cool. It's really cool. I thought it was cool just learning about the story without anyone trying to like translate it for me. Because usually when you go to church, you have people who are like, you know, reading you, you know, they're telling you what they think it means, and to just read the actual like story of it and like decipher the message yourself is pretty cool. But I read this quote and I'm like, that was really cool, and I felt so moved. And then the toy did it again. The toy went, instead of moving slowly like it's supposed to do, it went zzz, and turned all the way. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, the energy. Like, anyways, I'm gonna go read the rest of the text because I'm invested and I'm going down a rabbit hole. But let me know if you've read the story. Let me know, have you felt the presence of Jesus before? Let me know, because I think I have.